Or we are on week. We're on week 4. This is the final week of this study. We've been talking about the word apostle, what it means. It literally means one who is sent out. So like messenger, things like that. But so there's probably a lot of apostles, not to be confused with disciples. Sometimes we use them interchangeably, specifically when we're talking about the 12. Okay? But disciple just means follower, whereas apostle means one who is sent out. So it may not be a follower, it may be a leader. That makes sense. So, so there's probably a lot of apostles that we don't know about. If you've got my blog, I talked about several of those that have been attested to in Scripture that were called apostles, and that there's those that we don't have a whole lot of data on, those that are traditionally called apostles. But then we get, out of all these apostles, come to this group of 12. And so last week we began, let me pull up my screen so I don't confuse me. Share this screen here for everybody at home. For the 1 or 2 people that actually click on it. Okay. So last week we started talking about the Big 12. Specifically, we talked about Thaddeus, or Jude, or Judas, son of James, or Judas, not Iscariot, okay? Then we talked about Bartholomew, or Nathaniel. We talked about James, son of Alphaeus. We talked about Matthew, probably not Levi, the publican. We talked about Simon the Canaanian, Simon the Canaanite, and Simon the Zealot. You see things get easier from this point on. So we're going up to, let me click this. So going up to the next one of these, I showed y'all that chart last week. Y'all see it again here shortly. We get to Philip the Apostle. With Philip, we come to the first of the apostles who have New Testament stories. Even though he's on the list in the Synoptic Gospels, there are no synoptic stories. So he's mentioned, but there's no stories about him in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John's Gospel states that he's from Bethsaida, which is in the same town in Galilee that Andrew and Peter are from. He attends the wedding feast at Cana. He's at the feeding of the 5,000. Jesus asks him how he's going to feed the 5,000. He's the one that Jesus asked about that. So he's also at the Last Supper. During the Last Supper, Philip asked Jesus to show them, meaning all the disciples, to show them the Father. And nevertheless, scholars identify John as probably the least historical of the Gospels. Historical. But the most literary. In almost all of the cases, Philip's role is literary. He's asking Jesus a question about showing them the Father, which in turn sets up a teaching that Jesus is going to have, that Jesus is going to give, that explains the connection between Jesus, God, Jesus, and the Father. It's part of the literary creation of the Gospel of John, but we don't find out much about Philip. Okay, he's just a literary point in John's Gospel. However, he is the source of lots of later legends, and he figures into apocryphal texts, including a 2nd century writing called the Letter of Peter to Philip, and also a 4th century Gnostic gospel that purports to tell the Acts of Philip. During these Acts of Philip, which are kind of exciting, he gets into a magical duel with the sorcerers of Pharaoh, of all things. There are no pharaohs in the Christian age anymore. The Pharaoh and his sorcerers had really been part of the Old Testament story. The Old Testament serves as a source for many of the Christian texts. He gets in this duel with these sorcerers before getting himself beheaded. Other traditions have him crucified sideways or even upside down. His remains are also supposedly in Rome in the Basilica of Santa Apostoli, but another tradition has a tomb of his in Hierapolis, Turkey. And so if you ever get a chance to go to any of those places, I would certainly recommend.
So we got 2 graves.
Well, and you'll find, remember relics. Some places have the finger of one, the skull of another, the same guy. So, and the interesting thing, when it comes to relics, when you count up, if you were to add up all of the little pieces, all the slivers of wood of all of these basilicas and chapels and shrines, all the little slivers of wood that supposedly make up Jesus' cross, it's probably 20 times bigger than what it could be, than what it should be. So, yeah, you take relics with a grain of salt, okay, especially as Protestants. You take them with a grain of salt. Catholics, they revere these things. I don't want to throw our Christian brothers and sisters under the thing, our Catholic brothers under the bus here, but they certainly place more emphasis on the relics than
The more you look at them, they're a lot like Mormons.
No, they're nothing like Mormons. So that's the tomb in Hierapolis, Turkey. That picture. Yep.
So, when you go to these, I mean, I don't know if you've gone, but when you go to these, do they tell you what's in there, like ahead?
Oh yeah, these are tourist things too.
Oh, and they tell you here lies somebody's finger?
Yes.
He gave him a finger.
Okay. Yes.
So wasn't Simon Peter pretty old when he was with Jesus, and then Philip looked older, and so now we've got the end of the 2nd century.
Well, these are writings that were found, that were written or found in this time. They were probably written, which should give you information about it. Probably was not Peter that wrote them. Of course, whenever you get something called Acts that's a later writing. You got somebody that's writing not in contemporary, they're trying to give historical information about what's happening. So the letter to Peter, from Peter to Philip, oh yeah, 2nd century, they're both dead.
But they found the letters in the 2nd century?
No, they were probably written during.
So that means somebody
I have the same
else
question. You can't read
wrote it. Yeah.
Okay. Are you done? Questions so far on slide number 3? I've only got 1,800 slides here. Not bad.
Slide on.
Okay, so moving up the rung did I go backward?
You did.
How did that happen? I clicked the button.
Yeah, they may not be.
Okay.
They may.
So moving up the rung to ones that are better known, we get to Peter's brother Andrew, the apostle.
But
Now,
170 years later.
Andrew is known pretty much only as the brother of Simon, aka Peter. He figures into the story of Peter being called to be an apostle as he's right there with Peter, and he goes along with Peter. The brothers are fishermen from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee, same as Philip. Galilee is kind of a mixed region. Some of the people there are practicing Jews who speak Aramaic. Some of the people, though, are Greek speakers. Some follow the old gods. They're not practicing Jews. And there's also Samaritans near the south of them. So the fact that it's such a cosmopolitan and mixed region is highlighted by the fact that Andrew's name, very unusually, is Greek, not Hebrew like his brother Simon's. The family, for some reason, is picking names from both languages and traditions. Jesus calls his brothers from their fishing nets, calls these brothers from their fishing nets, saying in Mark 1:17, rather than being fishermen, I will make you fishers of people. That's from the NRS version. Most of y'all have heard, I will make you fishers of people. He's going to make them apostles and missionaries that are bringing people into the Christian kingdom. In the rest of the, come on. Here's my mouse. There we go. In the rest of the Gospels, Andrew pretty much fades into the background as Peter takes the spotlight. He nevertheless does inspire an apocryphal Gospel of Andrew and an apocryphal book of Acts of Andrew. Unfortunately, both of those were declared heretical. And as with so many heretical texts, they were burned and lost. So we don't have any texts of those, just references from other writers. Later traditions find Andrew running around in Georgia and Malta and Cyprus, across Slavic lands, and even all the way to Scotland. His remains are pretty much everywhere from Greece to Poland to Scotland. His legendary crucifixion on an X-shaped cross is what inspires the cross of St. Andrew, which is the flag of Scotland, which is a blue field with a white X across it. That forms part of the British Union Jack. If y'all didn't know that. And the British Union Jack combines the cross of St. George, the cross of St. Andrew, and an invented cross of St. Patrick, in order to have a union between England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland.
So on our chalice, disciples chapter 7.
That is the cross of St. Andrew, St. Andrew's cross.
No, that's not the way I understood it. I understood that it's a cross, but it's set so that when it's tilted, it looks like a cross, but when it's up, it doesn't. It is the same.
That's right, the disciples' tradition, because we come from Scotland. I mean, that's where where the camels came. Stone was here, but it's where the camels.
They were Presbyterian.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, they were free Presbyterians.
Yeah.
Did they have anything to do with Campbell's soup?
I mean, the name, who knows? All these, we all. Oh, yeah, here's a great, I love Bible trivia. Here's a great Bible trivia thing that's completely off topic. So if you follow the Bible from a historical, if it's true or if it's factual, let's put it that way. If it's factual, who is all of our closest relative? Who's our closest relative? You'd think Adam, but no. Because during the flood, the whole earth was destroyed, and so Noah would become our closest common relative. Everybody died except Noah and his 3 sons, and his wife, and his son's 3 wives. So 8 of them.
Oh, okay.
So
That is women. There we go.
A chance to start over.
Okay, so where was?
I don't know.
We need to go to the next slide. There we go. So Thomas the Apostle, once again, apostles who have increasingly fleshed out stories within the New Testament. Thomas means twin in Aramaic, but he's also called Didymus, which is the word for twin in the Greek. Okay. He's known as the apostle in John, who initially doubts that Jesus has been resurrected. So he's often called Doubting Thomas, based upon the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas, a wonderful read, by the way. You've got 2 Gospels of Thomas. You've got the Gospel of Thomas and you've got the infancy Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is more of a book of sayings. The infancy Gospel of Thomas provides those legendary stories of Jesus as a child. In both very interesting reads. I would certainly recommend reading them, keeping in mind that they're not canon, but they are certainly very interesting reads.
Are they both in the apocrypha? No.
Nope.
No.
Neither one of them. Let's see, where did I leave off?
Rather being doubting.
Yeah, I know, I lost where I was here. Okay, so based upon the apocryphal Gospel of Thomas, this may reflect something as to why the Johannine community, so the community that John is writing to, creates the texts that become known as the Gospel of John and the Epistles of John. They may be disagreeing with ideas that are held by other Christian communities that claim Thomas as their authority. Sometimes reason about the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Thomas is there's some of the earliest non-canonical writings that we still have copies of.
No, they were written before Mark.
No, they were written after Mark, but Mark is most definitely the earliest of the New Testament writings. Well, I say that other than Paul's letters are probably the earliest, but the earliest gospel. So Thomas is a big deal within the Christian community of late 1st century, second century time frame. But some that are in John, who is writing there at the end of the first century and things, they may be in disagreement with some of the things that are written from both of those communities. And so some rivals might say, well, I'm doing this with the authority of Peter. I'm doing with the authority, with the authority of Paul. Then you read a story. So they would then write a story where Peter denies Christ, where Peter is taken down. That may well be a story that goes all the way back. But I'm just using that as an example in the same way that Thomas doubts the resurrection. Maybe that's casting aspersions on other Christian communities that are claiming to act in Thomas's. Okay. So for clarification, what would happen is if you've got several writings that are out in the same time frame from purported apostles, their people are writing in their name and things. Well, in order to disparage the other group, you write something bad about that person. So that's why,
Whether
Yeah.
it's true or not.
right? That's why John may have a story. That's why John may include the story of Thomas Doubting. Okay. So anyway,
The spin doctors.
so there are several that are doing that because in addition to the Gospel of Thomas, there's also that infancy gospel I mentioned attributed to Thomas. Though attributed to Thomas, we have a little bit of the sayings gospel in its original Greek. That's the Gospel of Thomas, okay, not the infancy gospel. So when I say it's sayings gospel, that's going to be just the Gospel of Thomas. So, but none of the text is preserved in Coptic that was rediscovered buried in Egypt at the Nag Hammadi Library. It's really among the most important Christian texts that are outside of the canon in its present form, as I mentioned before. The Gospel of Thomas begins with these words. These are the hidden words that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymus Judas Thomas, another Judas, that Didymus Judas Thomas wrote them down. Okay, so Thomas is at least in the authority that the community that compiled the Gospel of Thomas in its latest form that we have, then put that saying at the beginning of it and attributed it to him. Okay? The Gnostic Christians, which this most certainly is a Gnostic text, that had owned the library, whether the Gospel of Thomas says we have it now is Gnostic or just simply a proto-Gnostic text. It was popular with people who were interested in Gnosticism in general. Gnostic Christians continue to have Thomas as one of the figures that they are in favor of. They didn't like Peter, but they do like Thomas and they do like Mary Magdalene. And as they later understood it and mythology increased about who Thomas was, they understood Thomas to be the twin of Jesus. I think I mentioned that before. That's why he was called twin. Very much akin to like Hellenistic stories of divine human pairings like Castor and Pollux. You've ever heard those stories? One of them is a god. The other one is mortal. Hercules has a mortal twin. There are these kinds of pairings, divine human twin pairing. So Thomas is just like Jesus. This is what this is saying. Thomas is just like Jesus, except he's the mortal one and Jesus is the divine. That's what the Gnostic writing said. That makes sense? Okay.
I wonder it wasn't paid.
That's why.
Amen.
Okay. So in addition to being adopted by the Gnostic community, there are associations with Thomas across the East and missions to the East, especially in India. In India, in the province of Kerala in southwest India, there's a home to a very ancient Christian community. We have sources for it that date all the way back to the 3rd century that are still there to this day. Right? So 200 years after Jesus was there, this Christian community was started and it still remains there, active. Okay. Now it's now known as they're now known as the St. Thomas Christians. They have associations with the churches that are further east than Eastern Orthodox, although they're now their own independent community. The adherents there in Kerala believe that Thomas himself was their founder, and that's an even more ancient association than Santiago, which came out in the 11th or the 12th century, the 1100s. It's certainly very ancient tradition, even if it's very unlikely that it's historical. Right? And that takes us all the way up to the last four. So we started at the bottom and now we're moving up. So we're at the last four, the ones we know most about and have the most stories about. Judas Iscariot, James the son of Zebedee, John the son of Zebedee, and Simon Peter. Right? So, okay. So Judas Iscariot is an interesting one, of course, because Judas is the bad guy. Judas is the one who betrays Jesus, and he is that way already in the very first list. As we read the list in Mark, the very last one named is Judas Iscariot, who handed him over. Jesus also very clearly identifies Jesus as a betrayer and is also very clearly embedded in the Passion narrative. As they're having the Last Supper and Jesus is saying, one of you is going to betray me, one of the 12 here is within that context of understanding. Specifically, Judas as a betrayer and as being part of that 12, big 12. There's also an incredibly early association with the 12 in the Mark Passion narrative, which is the earliest Passion narrative that we have, but it's also found in the Passion narratives that we have in the Gospel of John. And it's the two of those that create one of those still outstanding issues that we have. In the Christian tradition, the synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, who are together on just about everything. That is how scholars explain literary dependency. That's a literary critical method of discernment and study scripture. Most of the Gospel of John, though, is crazily different from the three of them until you get to the very end. And then suddenly in the Passion narrative, so many elements overlap, including these ideas with Judas. Many scholars posit that there may be a pre-Markan, so a Passion story before Mark that's lost, one that Mark even used as his source. But that also maybe the author of John had as well. In any event, it does seem like Judas and the betrayal are early stories. They're some of the earliest attestations because they're included in all four. That makes sense? Okay. It's also seen in Paul as another level of attestation because Paul, when he's talking about the institution of communion as a sacrament, he talks about Jesus doing this on the night that he was betrayed and handed over to the Romans. So we've got a lot of attestation about the Passion narrative. And so that leads scholars to believe that was certainly one of the very first stories that was written down and has survived. And it's probably has some historical value. Where was I? Okay, so the implication again is that there were early multiple attested traditions with Judas. We can also tell, for example, in the same way, the synoptic problem is when some of the stories don't quite align. The authors of Luke and Matthew are working from Mark as their source. Mark doesn't conclude his story, though, with a happy conclusion where the traitor gets his just deserts. But Matthew and Luke create death stories for Jesus. In one, he hangs himself. Y'all know what happens in the other one?
Throws himself off into the waters.
Yeah, some kind of accident, and he ends up disemboweled. Okay. Because they're contradictory or seemingly contradictory. They don't tell the same death. It shows anybody who wants to read the Bible as inherent literalistic history, it does have trouble of internal contradiction. Okay? The two stories are not very easily reconcilable, although people do try. So he hung himself, and as he hung there for 3 days, either birds came and pecked at him or his body just decayed enough that he disemboweled. You see how you have to really distance yourself from what could happen or what happened from what could happen. So scholars do try to reconcile this, it's just not. So. Hmm?
Is this a case of them thinking of the worst? You said they often make up a story.
Mhm.
Is this a case of thinking of the worst death so that he is remembered for that? I mean,
Well, okay, let me give you a scenario. I think I've mentioned it I know I've mentioned it in previous classes, whether all we already heard. When you talk about the four gospels, they have the three main gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John's kind of out there. You end up with stories that are very, very similar, but the details are slightly different. It's very similar to a thief going into a convenience store, and after everything's done, the police come, they interview the teller and they interview the three other people that were in the restaurant to get descriptions of the thief. And all of them are telling the truth, but not all their details match up. Okay. We get a very similar thing. So here, I'll give you a hypothetical scenario. Let's say that this is kind of reconciling. You have one or two apostles one apostle, one gospel writer that hears a story that Judas hung himself. Okay. And then after a little while, people saw that. He went up on a cliff and hung himself. Well, after a few days, they find him out there. So people take him down to bury him. But in the process, they drop him or something happens. And what happens is when another writer comes along and is interviewing one of the people that found him that's taking him down off this thing, what he hears is this story about a disembowelment, an evisceration of some sort. Okay. And so that's what they focus on. Are they both telling the truth? Yes, but their details are wrong, or they're different. So that's kind of the scenario. Okay, so we'll just say one more thing about Judas in terms of extra legendary things. He does have his own gospel, the Gospel of Judas. But it's a Gnostic gospel where different Christians have decided he's been misunderstood and they tried to give him his own perspective. Okay. If you've ever read the gospel, I've got a copy of it all. So you're going to read it. Gospel of Judas. It's like a defense of his actions. Okay. That's pretty much what it is.
Well, if we didn't have Judas,
right.
He's a big part of the story.
Well, Jesus had to die for the purposes, had to die in a human manner, and betrayal is one of those elements.
But part of that is, that he betrayed him, yes, but people have always tried to figure out why.
Right.
What was his motivation? Was he trying to play a stand? Did he really not believe him? There's this trying to get in his head of what Judas was, really thinking and why he did it.
And one of the biggest arguments as to the why has to do with money. Because it's very clearly stated that he handled the treasury bag for out of the 12, he was the treasurer. That it's very clearly stated in scripture. Also, when he's talking with the Pharisees, they're talking money about the betrayal. And so, money is certainly an element. And that may be where one of the stories about you can't love God and mammon or God money is some people. That's maybe where that story came from.
Maybe Judas thought if Jesus was going to be the king, established, then there was going to be a lot of money in that, especially for the people that were following him.
Correct. And that's where Simon the Zealot comes into play too, because the Zealots, they were all about a mystic and conqueror.
Right.
Right. So, anyway. There's a very diverse group of 12. Very educated ones, very not so educated ones. Tradesmen, missions, anyway. Okay. Okay, on to the next one.
Which is the church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
The church, we're all made up of people.
That is what sets Christianity apart from most other pagan nations. Okay. So we already talked a little bit about James the Great. That was in week one. Remember, Santiago, Saint Doug, or what? But Iago is another. It's a mystery. We've anglicized it. It ends up becoming James. So we started off our talk about Santiago. Later tradition that at a certain point he was whisked away by angels in a rudderless boat and makes his way all the way to Galicia. He's one of the apostles that figures into the synoptic narrative a lot. There is a pairing that Mark has of Peter, James, and John. James and John, in Mark's understanding, are brothers, and he gives them this nickname, the same way that Peter has a nickname, although it's a nickname that doesn't stick. That nickname is the Sons of Thunder. Okay. He doesn't explain why, but he does pair them in this way together. This image here is of the Transfiguration vision. Jesus goes up on the mount to Mount of Transfiguration with Peter, James, and John. I had to cut them off in order to, when I was trying to paste them on here, they just didn't paste very. He's transfigured before them, and they see him in glory along with a vision of Elijah and a vision of Moses. The question I have, though, and this is one of these coincidences that does exist. I don't believe in coincidences, okay, as a believer and as a human. Okay. But if there were coincidences, if they truly exist, this is one of them. It's because there's so many of these guys named James. And remember, James is really Jacob, Iago. There's so many people named James. If Mark, to get some of his narrative, is familiar with Paul, and he's been reading Paul's letters, remembering that that the acknowledged pillars of the church that Paul puts together are Peter, James, and John. So they probably know each other. But it's not James the Great in Paul. What if that's the trick here? What if it's not James the Great? In Paul, remember, it's James, the brother of Jesus, not James, the brother of John. So I always wonder if perhaps in writing this version of the story, we aren't having a situation with Mark that are at odds with this group, the poor of Jerusalem, the Church of Jerusalem. He wants to discount their authority as they have been led by James, the brother of Jesus, and by Jude, the brother of James, which in turn becomes Jude, the brother of Jesus. I wonder, yeah.
Kind of
Really, yeah. I wonder if the author of Mark deliberately replaces one of the central pillars, one James, with a different James, and has therefore elevated a character. Here, the brother of John, and made another character the son of. Okay, that's my speculation. It's truly just mine. It's just an interesting thing that there's this Peter, James, and John connection that is in Paul, but it's also maintained as a vastly different thing. We also have in Mark many instances where Jesus' brothers think that he's crazy. They're not followers. So even though we know from other sources that they are his followers at some point or another. So Mark does seem to be trying to disparage the brothers of Jesus in some way. Okay. I know a lot. That's a lot. That was a lot of information. So moving on to even more confusion. Next, who's known as John the Beloved, is actually John and the Beloved. I believe that. They're not the same person. As we saw from Paul, this is one of the characters that we know is a historical figure. This is somebody that Paul met, one of the acknowledged pillars of the Church of Jerusalem. But as with so many characters, this also becomes a bunch of conflated figures. There are some issues with the authorship of gospel attributed to John. The scholarly consensus is that it's anonymous, written in at least 2 stages because the seams are very obvious. There's a final redactor editor who's not anywhere near as good as the person who writes in the middle of the book. There may well be an interior text called the Science Gospel by scholars, which may well be the first or original component of the text. None of these are said to be written within the text by anybody named John. There is a place in the text where it says This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and has written them, and we know that his testimony is true, referring to the beloved disciple. But in fact, the beloved disciple, who's a character throughout the Gospel of John, is not named and could very possibly, very probably, I believe, not be named John. That is a later attribution and association. The character in the Gospel of John, the beloved disciple, the conflation that with that character and the historical figure of John isn't particularly warranted. There are less warranted connections. For example, conflating John the Revelator, writer of Revelation, John the Apocalypticist, the author of the book of Revelation, he's also known as the Apocalypticist, who is probably another guy named John, who doesn't even pretend to write anything like the kind of Greek that's in the Gospel of John or the letters attributed to John. They write in two different forms of Greek. These are probably all different people, part of whom are named John, but maybe some of them may not be. You know, they're writing in the name of John in order so it can be attested, you know, it have more power. The guy, John, who the Revelator, John of Patmos, is named John, but he may just be another guy. What we could say, though, about John the Beloved is there is a historical figure, a beloved figure. There's also a character, okay, of this beloved disciple. So these are wedged together, and there becomes a community that acts in John's name that we call the Johannine community. They may have a tradition that John was one of the youngest disciples and lived an exceptionally long time, but they're conflating a lot of things together to make that attestation. And it doesn't have much validation. So there is some history. There are some hints to that. As one of the most attested disciples, there is a historical figure here at the root. But with the characteristics, we can't really necessarily say for sure. I know I'm just blowing everybody's faith up now.
Well, I was about to say, you know, we're Christians. We say we're Christians, but you know what I'm about to say.
I know.
I mean, what do we base our faith on if we can't be sure that that's.
And that's why I started this off. That's why I started the class off by saying we are looking at this strictly from a historicity point of view. We're not looking at it necessarily from a faith.
Jesse used to say, this is the Bible, it is true and can be trusted. And the true part, see, it's just like you were talking, it is true.
Fact and truth are not
Two
necessarily
different things, right?
Okay. That leads us now to finally the most known and most attested of all the apostles. This guy who was born Simon, who got his name changed to the Rock, or hey, Rocky. By Jesus, think about that, you know. Jesus calling him Rocky. Somebody who does continue to be one of the leaders of the early Christian community, who meets with Paul several times. We know that he's engaged in apostolic missionary journeys, plantings that Paul is also engaged in, because Paul talks about him being active in Antioch, which is the Roman capital of Syria. Although we don't have as much contemporary evidence as we would like to have, there are ideas that are early, that he's martyred, that Peter is martyred, and there are some hints that it could be in Rome, the way Christian tradition has it. Later Christian tradition has his martyrdom on the Vatican Hill, and then ultimately, retroactively, he's understood to have been the first bishop of Rome, or the first pope.
Yeah.
So, if y'all didn't know that, that's the Pope's main title. He's got a lot of titles, but his main title is Bishop of Rome. People even think that they have his tomb because they found a very ancient tomb that is attributed to him. But we also have a very ancient tomb that is attributed to Jesus. In other words, if it just gets back within 200 years of their supposed death, that's still not close enough to have said that it is actually their tomb. In any event, there was a Peter. He was particularly important in the early part of the movement. But all the rest of the characteristics we have to weigh within the light of the later tradition. So that's my overview of what we can know. Some of the traditions that developed afterwards that continue to be celebrated and lived out in the life of Christians everywhere, from Salerno to St. Andrews, Scotland to India. People have their own traditional associations of these apostolic founders. There is one other potentially apostolic figure that I do want to mention just briefly here. That is Mary Magdalene. In some of the later Christian traditions, in many of the later Christian traditions, especially when it comes to the Gnostic writings, Mary Magdalene is seen as being one of the apostles spending a lot of time with the 12, if not part of the 12 at some point. Because she's such an important figure in the canonical stories, there are later gospels attributed to Mary Magdalene, Gospel of Mary and Mary. So, as we saw, apostles can be female and male. Later, she's understood to be part of that apostolic group from what we have in the canon, in our Bible. It's not as clear if that's the role that she has, because I think there's also another very important role in early Christianity, and that one was certainly often held by women. And it was even in Paul's time, where wealthy women who were interested in the spiritual movement are backers who support these mendicant travels. So Mary Magdalene is described as one of the women in the Gospel of Luke. So that would be the other possibility, okay, as a supporter. Either Mary Magdalene is emblematic of women that can be wealthier supporters of the movement, who are doing that, or she may represent one who is more like an actual disciple of Jesus, who functions and maybe even operates as one of the apostles, whether she's one of the 12 or not. Okay. So, where was my mouse? So, that is my survey of the apostles. I go into more apostles in the blog. So, but we mainly talk about the 12, their historicity, what we can know of them, what their role was about in antiquity, in the earliest part of the Jesus movement, and then in early Christianity, and why apostles were phased out by the church as it developed as an institution. Because the rules for apostleship was you had to know Jesus in a physical form. Well, eventually you run out of people. Okay, that's it. That is 4 weeks of the apostles.
Thank you.
Congratulations.
The waters are muddy.
Oh, certainly. That was the whole point. That's my job, is to create more questions. Any questions, concerns, criticisms, complaints?
They left the letter J.
They love James.
No.
They love Jude.
Yeah.
They love Jacob.
It's like everybody's name with a J, and if you're John, you might live forever because you come back as this person John, and this person John, and this person John,
Well, I'm thinking we had so many Johns, here and there. Yeah. John Atterbury, two of them.
Yeah.
John Wood, John Parkin, John Cootie. We had I'm missing one.
John Woods.
I mentioned
Oh,
John.
did you?
I'm missing one. And it wasn't John Foster, but that's another John. Anyway.
And since I married Ron, my initials are JC.
Yeah.
Oh,
Mine are Mr. T. Okay. No questions? Okay, well, let's get out of here and get ready for worship.
yeah, too many questions.
Pretty quick.
It's true. It's true.
Hey, you're sounding like a professional wrestler now. There's a professional wrestler named Kurt Angle who, interestingly, he was also an Olympic gold medalist in freestyle wrestling at the '96 Olympics in Atlanta. Broke his neck for the semifinal match, even though he won it, and went on to win the gold medal with a broken neck. Anyway, he went on to professional wrestling. And he would get in the ring with his medals because he had other medals. And he'd get in there and he'd say something profound. He went, "Oh, it's true. It's true."
But can it be trusted?
Oh, I need to turn this off.
But if you say it with, if you say it with conviction, then people will believe.
There you go.
It's
In the recording.
all in the way that you say it.
That's right.